You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're listening in on a conversation hosted by Seamless Bay Area about the updated California State Rail Plan. Adina Levin of Seamless Bay Area hosts Shannon Simonds, Eric Goldwyn, and Adriana Rizzo in discussion. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've also got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight net bike scarf is back in stock. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to make some new designs, but if you want to get one of the Buster Bike scarves or the Lightweight Bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarcholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. A quick note for Patreon supporters. I've set up an ad-free podcast RSS feed at Patreon. This means if you want to listen to the show without ads or promotional episodes in your podcatcher of choice, you can do so by heading over to your Patreon account and getting the feed there. I'll post instructions in the show notes of how to do it. And if you aren't a Patreon supporter, you can do so by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Even just $1 a month gets you our podcast free of outside ads. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. This episode was kindly shared with us by Seamless Bay Area. This was part of an online forum they held, and the video can be found on YouTube. Check out the show notes for a link to both ways to support Seamless Bay Area and the video of this discussion. All right, let's listen in.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adina Levin. I'm Executive Director of Seamless Bay Area, which is a nonprofit focusing on achieving a world-class high ridership system of rail and public transportation that is convenient and planned and built as a network in order to be able to achieve the goals of the state of California. And in order to achieve this, it's important for the service to be well coordinated and fast and frequent and be implemented in a way that delivers public value for the public funding that we put into the system. So the California State Rail Plan is a major blueprint for the state to help achieve this goal. For the last several years, Seamless has organized events and activities for the public as well as for professionals and political leaders to learn about international good practices for achieving that sort of well-coordinated and effective network. And we're going to learn today about how the California State Rail Plan utilizes some of these practices, as well as some opportunities to improve in order to be able to achieve those goals in a more fast and cost-effective and timely manner. We're here to learn from experts, including Shannon Simonds, who's the Chief Officer of Rail Planning and Implementation for California. And she's going to talk about the State Rail Plan and its goals and how it is, in fact, implementing these international good practices. We're going to hear from Eric Goldwyn, who is the Program Director of the NYU Marron School of Urban Management and is leading the Transit Cost Project, which is providing really important information about how to improve the cost and cost effectiveness of rail and transit around the country and the world. And we're going to hear from Adriana Rizzo, who is a co-founder of Californians for Electric Rail, a nonprofit advocacy organization. And we're going to learn from her about some case studies and reforms that have been done and need to be done in order to be able to achieve the goals of the State Rail Plan. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Shannon Simonds. If you have some questions, please do put them into the Q&A section and we will get to them at the end.
Thank you. Good morning. Like Adina said, I'm going to start with a quick overview of the California State Rail Plan and then talk a little bit about how we developed the State Rail Plan through service-led planning, and then about some of the programs that we're looking to in the future for implementation. So first, Rail Plan overview. The Rail Plan establishes a strategic vision for prioritizing state investment in the passenger and freight rail network statewide. Really, we're looking to provide a framework for that coordination between planning partners, rail operators, rail owners, and the state to develop a rail network with a strategic vision in mind. This is very important because in California, there's a lot of different ownership and responsibility, from managing to planning to ownership of the equipment to ownership of the rights of way in the airspace. And pretty much for any decision that gets made, there's at least 4 different public and private entities that need to be involved to make that decision. So having a coordinated framework and a coordinated process through service-led planning is extremely important to helping us be able to make decisions and move forward on project development and ultimately delivery. So what's new since 2018? So this 2024 update really looked to enhance the rail service in the public interest and serve as a basis for both federal and state rail investments in passenger and freight rail projects. So first, we revised the state vision. This included incorporating outputs from various network integration activities and other local and regional studies from across the state since our last update. Then we look to advise priorities for state investments. So we're updating the operating and capital investments and looking towards delivering a phased implementation of the network. And then lastly, devising implementation strategies. So we're working to coordinate across funding and operating agencies to structure a service implementation that is phased to deliver interim benefits sooner while we, can get the capital for some of the larger investments. This is really what the Rail Plan is all about. This is the vision for the passenger network strategy. So it's based on these 3 main components. First is that it's oriented around an integrated statewide network. So high-speed rail is serving those longer distance trips, really the backbone of the network, but that's really not the whole of it. The intercity and the regional services provide that additional mobility for local and regional travel in and of itself, but also by making really high quality connections to each other and to the high-speed rail network to maximize the benefits and the mobility of the network. And then the integrated express bus services fill in those lower ridership times in the schedule. They provide connections to rural communities and provide for rail network connections using the highway system. The second point here is coordinated schedules. And I will talk about this briefly in the service-led planning section, but the entire network is designed around regular pulsed service, which means that we are strategically targeting schedules to pulse into and out of key transfer hubs at the same time on the hour every hour. So if the intercity train is coming at the 5 after the hour, it will always come at the 5 after the hour. And we can build our schedules to ramp that up or ramp that down as needed to meet market demand, but it's pulsing into and out of key transfer hubs, which then facilitates seamless transfer between services. If we know that the intercity service will always be there at 5 after the hour, then as the local transit provider or the regional rail service provider, you can make strategic and coordinated schedule changes to make sure that your buses and your light rail services are feeding into that network before the 5 and circulating people out to their final destinations after the train arrives at the 5 after the hour. And then lastly, the vision is all about being customer focused. So again, those seamless first and last mile connections with local transit, but also working with our partners on the land use and complete street side to make sure that there is high quality connectivity to the stations for pedestrians and bicyclists and other modes. We're also working with our partners on the California Integrated Travel Project, which is focused on improving integrated ticketing and trip planning, as well as contactless and simplified payments to make the entire user experience of how to plan and pay for a trip much easier to navigate. And then lastly, all of this is strategically designed to be both competitive to auto and air travel in terms of cost, ease of travel, and also the comfort. And these are just some real quick rail plan by the numbers. So the plan identifies $307 billion in total capital investments across the near, mid, and long-term time horizon, which is a lot. But in turn, we will see $537 billion in economic return on those investments by 2050. This is around 200 million daily passenger miles shifting from highways to the statewide network, mostly by capturing some of the longer distance trips. In terms of zero emission, we will be converting our current 51 miles in the state, represented by the Caltrain corridor of overhead electrification, expanding that to 1,500 miles by 2050. And then we have 9 corridors already identified for coordinated project development federal funding. And then I just like to put this image on the side to show how efficient, spatially efficient rail is, and that one high-speed train can accommodate 918 people, which is equivalent to all of these things: 5 medium-haul aircrafts, 15 long-distance coach buses, and 612 autos at a 1.5 average occupancy. So we all know it, but I like to show and see how efficient rail is. So service-led planning, this is what underpins all of the work that goes into the rail plan. Service-led planning, these are the design principles behind that. The first is service-led design. So designing a network to support service goals first, which can be something like hourly service, half-hourly service. And then we're only identifying the infrastructure or even the equipment that's needed to support the network. So we're not just going out and saying we need to double, triple, quadruple track the entire state, being really strategic about where do we need to identify infrastructure to support our service goals. The second principle is that we're designing an intuitive network. So we want to simplify and standardize service patterns. Like I was saying, have that arrive at the 5 after the hour, the schedules as well, the connections and the operations and the ticketing. All of this is meant to make it, more intuitive as a traveler so that you're not beholden to a schedule that is different every single time you're trying to get on a train. You can predictably navigate how to get on your train and then make the connections once you get to your destination. The third principle is that we're targeting direct connections. This does not mean one-seat rides to everywhere from everywhere, but it means being, again, strategic and intentional about minimizing physical and temporal distance between services so that passengers can easily transfer across a platform or over to a bus bay. So this picture I like to show because I think it's also important to note that direct connections can happen without a ton of infrastructure. So our stations don't have to be Grand Central to facilitate good timed connections. It can be as simple as, again, a small bit of infrastructure targeting specific times on the clock so that you can easily transfer from that bus to that train or vice versa. And then lastly, all of this is designed to organize the meets at stations at regular intervals at hub stations. So again, that pulsed scheduling where you're, again, pulsing into and out of a station on a predictable clock face time allows us to be intentional with those time transfers and make it really easy for people to navigate the system. This is the process for service-led planning. It's not that complicated. We want to start first with developing planning parameters. And from a methodological standpoint, we like to start by developing the long-term vision. This really helps us to understand and articulate how the ideal end state looks like, and then allows us to develop a phased implementation back while scaling up our current and planned investments so that we're being strategic about, protecting against redundant or stranded investments in the near and midterm, making sure that we're building towards that idealized end state. So the first thing we do is we develop planning parameters. So things like connections, frequency, trip times, identify those from all the partners involved in developing a service. We put in some of the operating and infrastructure considerations where there may be harder parameters that we need to account for. Then we come up with an initial design. We take all of the feedback from all of the partners and we have a first take at a service concept. And then we have a trade-offs analysis. We really talk about, do we need this much service out of, a certain station to another? Or can we maybe serve that with an hourly service and making better connections downstream? From that, we refine the concept based on the feedback and other statewide priorities. Maybe there's, some mandate on zero emission that we need to, or other policy that we need to consider. And then once we agree on a concept for the service, then we look at the phasing strategy. Again, looking at what can we actually implement first to deliver those interim benefits while building towards the larger capital project. So why do we do it? I know it's a lot of words, but stick with me. So the reason that we do this is because we have a lot of complex questions to answer, right? So these decisions that we're trying to make, they're very complex. And there's this, large group of stakeholders. We have consequential social equity considerations, and all of this is very time and resource intensive. And we also have to navigate, a range of technical questions supporting service planning and environmental impacts, engineering, project development, all of that. And so we need a better plan to be able to do that, or a planning process to be able to do that. The second thing is, we all know costs and timelines are insufficient to meet our goals. We know that the state has ambitious equity, environmental, and economic goals, and our current delivery timelines and costs are insufficient. And so the planning phase is an opportunity to reduce some of that complexity and drive better outcomes. And then lastly, strategic service planning is a tool to make decisions. So transparent, reproducible analysis that's scaled to the appropriate level of detail to answer the decision in question. The documentation and coordination of the process, the parameters, the recommendations, it's also critical to working across multiple stakeholder groups, jurisdictions, and planning horizons. And this is increasingly important as we work with host railroads. We run passenger rail service mostly in California on privately owned freight railroad corridors. And so we want to have a more standardized process that is documenting decisions and including engagement early and often so that we can work with them to consider their needs as well as we're developing projects, which will help us to implement things more efficiently. And so this is basically the toolkit. There's service, operations, equipment, and infrastructure are the different types of levers we have to make improvements. We can either look at operational improvements, things like decreasing dwell time through things like level boarding, improved transfers. We can look to the equipment side. So maybe there's an opportunity if we're going to buy new fleet in a corridor anyway to look at equipment that can accelerate or decelerate more quickly, get to top speeds faster or have different top speeds, and that allows us to utilize our existing infrastructure differently and more efficiently in many cases. On the infrastructure side, we can do things like straightening curves, upgrading old tracks or outdated signal systems, all things that allow us to better use the railroad that we have. And then service, again, this is where we like to start. We want to design a service to maximize the utilization of our existing infrastructure first, and then look to make these more expensive decisions later. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about how we move from planning to project development. And one of the big opportunities is through the new Federal Railroad Administration Corridor Identification and Development Program, or Corridor ID. So the Corridor ID program is a new federal program that's intended to develop a sustained, comprehensive intercity passenger rail planning and development program. The idea is that it will set forth a capital project pipeline that then is ready for federal funding. So this Corridor ID program, one of the requirements is that you develop a service development plan, or an SDP. And those are meant to establish the service concepts and the necessary capital projects to actually operate the service in a corridor. So the SDPs will identify, again, phased infrastructure investments to accomplish the service goals identified in the rail plan. So it fits really nicely with the system that we're already trying to establish here in California. So these are the corridors across the country. 69 corridors were selected and 9 of those were in California. The ones highlighted in the teal text are the ones that Caltrans is actually the sponsor for. And you can see the map on the right side. It's pretty much the entire California state rail network. So this is a big opportunity to get this all into a federal planning and project development pipeline that will allow us to more efficiently deliver on service-led planning and develop capital projects that are strategic and competitive for funding. So this is what the Corridor ID program looks like in a snapshot. That systems planning era, we think of that as the rail plan. That's kind of the initial input guiding the service development plans rather for each of the corridors. And then Corridor ID itself is the project planning and project development phase where we will get through, again, all of those service concepts and then through preliminary engineering and environmental. And then that sets us up for competitive funding in the implementation stages of final design, construction, and ultimately operations. I won't get into it too much, but I wanted to show everyone what the Corridor ID program really is and why this is such a big opportunity. It's a 3-step program. Step 1, the FRA gave each corridor money to just develop a scope, schedule, and budget. They wanted to show their commitment to, giving money to support this program, even through the scoping phases. Step 2 is 90% federal match to develop those service development plans that I was mentioning. So the final service development plan will include that capital project inventory as part of your phased implementation plan. And then those projects may advance into step 3 of project development at the FRA's discretion based on readiness, which gets you into the environmental review, or NEPA, and the preliminary engineering stage. So once you're in step 3, then you're coordinating again with the Federal Railroad Administration to complete the preliminary engineering and environmental review for all of your projects. And then when you kind of graduate out of Corridor ID, your projects go into a pipeline that may be prioritized for federal funding under Fed-State partnership, which is, the big capital program right now at the federal level. So we're really excited about being able to kind of implement the vision and the process that we've already established in the rail plan with direct coordination with the Federal Railroad Administration to more efficiently move through planning and project development and hopefully get, more projects out the door for construction funding and ultimately built. And then lastly, this is looking ahead for the rail plan. So next steps, again, corridor ID, and we're excited about that. We want to continue to lay the framework for growth. So service-led planning will continue to increase efficiencies and inform our fleet decisions, our capital investments, and how we're designing phased implementation. The Caltrans zero emission strategy sets the course to develop and deploy zero emission trains in California beyond the electrified Caltrain and California high-speed rail networks. And then lastly, personally exciting to me in my office is just increasing the utilization of the rail plan. So we want to develop a more web-based components of the rail plan to, increase transparency in tracking projects, both their progress and their funding commitments, but also provide more digestible fact sheets and information of the progress of these projects and everything that's going on from the rail plan. So you don't have to wait 4 to 6 more years for an update. Everyone can go and access that on more of an annual update. So we're pretty excited to get that implemented for everyone. And with that, I will stop and pass it over to Adriana.
Thanks very much. And I want to hand it to Eric. So in prepping for this discussion, Eric, you look at various plans all over the country and around the world. And you said that I don't know what the geographic scope was of the comment, but this is the best plan I've seen. So can you explain what it was that you thought that was the best, and then what additionally can be done and would be helpful to be done to enable the delivery of this plan in a more cost-effective and timely manner?
Sure. First of all, Shannon, that was a very informative presentation. What I meant was I've looked over state rail plans, not tons of them, but in doing some of our research, first of all, the FRA has an inventory. I recommend any of you go click on those links. Most of them don't link to anything. But then if you start searching for them, you can see that some of them haven't been updated. And I think the New York one was last updated in 2009, for instance. But then when you start to read them, they're just not very ambitious in scope. I think if I'm remembering from one, it was sort of like, we hope to basically keep going really slowly on this corridor. We're not electrifying. Maybe we'll get some new rolling stock. It's sort of on that level. And when you read this one, you want to go from 50 electrified miles to 1,500 electrified miles. And electrification is so important if you want to be competitive with other modes of transport. I think as long as the train is lagging behind automobiles, it's just going to be very hard to get real modal shift. And I think what we're seeing with Caltrain is that, hey, electric trains really do get people to switch. You filled me in on some of the data the other day. And so, I really love that about this plan. The other thing in here that to me is really interesting is that it sounds like Caltrans sort of wants to be this sort of like nerve center at the middle of all of this and sort of help some of these other agencies do the planning. There's language in there about, inventories and databases to share. And I think one of the things that if you talk to operators, they're always looking to answer some question that they come up against. And so having a state DOT that is saying, we're going to be sort of a central repository and we're going to be diffusing knowledge and information and helping you, if they can execute on that, I think that is just a massive benefit. So that's sort of, where I was going in terms of why I think I think there's actual ambition in this vision, which is often lacking when it comes to trains. So in terms of, cost effectiveness and things like that, I think a lot of it comes down to, building that capacity in Caltrans, like how helpful they can be, how they can sort of parachute in and move projects along and, collect learnings along the way. I was recently talking to a former official who was saying, we keep doing these projects over and over again, but there's no mechanism for learning and there's no mechanism for sort of sharing knowledge. And so again, when I read the plan, I was like, oh, maybe there's something here in having sort of a more centralized approach. Again, I think electrification with Caltrain is a great example of how you get modal shift. I think there are some things we could do to, reduce those costs. And now that we've done the one project, and obviously we have California high-speed rail going, hopefully there are lessons learned and ways to sort of move this forward really faster, I think is most important, but, more cost effectively. And then, I've looked at some of the questions in here. The open question about federal funding, I obviously have no idea, but there's also, transportation reauthorization in a year or two that also will be super important to keep mind of and to track. So those are sort of, my initial thoughts.
Okay, thanks. And want to ask you some follow-up questions and make a follow-up comment on the Caltrain electrification, which is, I think, an early star of this approach. When the Caltrain electric service went fully live in September, since then, the weekday ridership has gone up by 40 to 50%, and the weekend ridership has doubled. And that is an outcome of faster service, more frequent service, where off peak it's 30 minutes, which is still sort of world class, but still much better than the previous hourly. And the Bay Area has instituted a twice a year schedule coordination. So it's now better coordinated with other services as well. So you had mentioned having increased state capacity as something that can help lower costs. This is something that in the US is, for a few decades seems maybe counterintuitive. There was a concept of, maybe having a more lean state infrastructure would be better, but it sounds like you're saying something different. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think if you're going to build one thing one time, there's no need to build sort of that muscle memory within our institutions. But, this is a long, far-reaching plan with near-term, mid-term, and long-term goals. Shannon's going to be busy for a really long time. And what that means is, she needs resources to come up with the best plan she can. She needs bodies, knowledge, tools to diffuse that knowledge. So, Southern California, Northern California, whatever, are able to sort of tap into all the stuff that her office is doing. Again, I don't remember the number. I think there are like 13 people in the office. I don't know why that number's in my mind. Maybe I made that up. But, $300 billion worth of projects is, that's a big number. And, it sounds like looking at sort of the CID template during those service plans, it's a big job identifying all the infrastructure, just doing all that stuff. The other thing I'll say as a non sequitur that I like about the plan is things tend to be very corridor based in the US, the way that we do our planning for transportation. And Caltrans is the right entity to say, hey, let's look at the state. Let's look at the state network. Whereas there's no incentive for smaller regional agencies to do that. So yes, in terms of the capacity, I think, having people in Caltrans who can do some of that planning, who can do the scoping, not being completely reliant on consultants, I think bring them in to sort of learn stuff and to build that capacity. I don't know who wrote what in this plan. It does have a very strong, what I know of Deutsche Bahn, of sort of their fingerprint on it. There is also a picture somewhere of a German operations center. But I think over time, we could sort of have that expertise within Caltrans, and then they can diffuse that knowledge rather than calling on for more and more consultants, because consultants come in and come out, they forget things, they're not sort of perfect in that regard, whereas people that work at these agencies hopefully will be there for years and decades to sort of keep things moving in the same direction.
All right, thanks. Now I'm going to go to Adriana Rizzo, who's going to talk about some case studies and ways that the state rail plan could be useful, and we'll do some Q&A jumping off those case studies.
Yeah, so I think generally there's a lot to love about the state rail plan. I think we're very excited about it. And so I'm just going to go through a few cases of why some of the reforms in here are very needed. So one of these things that Shannon talked about is host railroad coordination. And we did get a question in the chat about, railroads being sort of not cooperative or being a problem for passenger rail service. And that's certainly true. I think one example of this would be the Roseville third track project on Capitol Corridor, which is supposed to bring 10 trains an hour up to Roseville. It's a very simple capacity project, involves building a layover facility. Union Pacific was negotiating with Capitol Corridor for 12 years about using one of their yards as a layover facility before pulling out, just walking out of negotiations, forcing Capitol Corridor to design and build a completely different site for this that involved demolitions. And as a result, this project still hasn't started construction, even though it's been in planning and the discussion for 18 years. So the uncooperative freights certainly are going to be an issue with implementing the state rail plan. However, the state has a lot more leverage than local agencies to force concessions. I think the state just brings a lot more power to the table compared to, local JPAs. which is important, of course, for electrification, because as somebody asked and Shannon alluded to, some of these corridors that are planned to be electrified in 2050 are owned by Class 1 railroads. I've highlighted them in blue here. And we know that the state can win on this issue. For instance, the California High-Speed Rail Authority has been able to come to an agreement with BNSF to allow electrification on tracks that BNSF owns between LA and Fullerton. And so we know that when we get the state involved, we have a lot more power than these local agencies. And, the state rail plan also includes pathing study, which I think is important as another tool for leverage to show actually, this thing we want to do is feasible and will benefit both parties. And I think this is relevant for electrification of freight rail. For example, the Department of Energy recently identified the Southern Transcon, which is kind of highlighted over here in Southern California, as like a priority corridor for freight electrification. This is something where partnership between the state and freight railroads could be really fruitful. Freight railroads have certainly objected to rail electrification in the past. I think that's certainly an issue, but I think, bringing more leverage to the table, as well as being willing to share costs and not place all costs on the Class 1s, I think is part of the solution as well. This does lead me to something I think is sort of missing from the state rail plan, is there's not much discussion of freight electrification or zero emission strategy for freight, which is a little bit confusing given freight has a lot more emissions than passenger rail does. But maybe I'll just pause here and add for comments. I do have some other case studies as well, but
Yeah, so I want to turn some of this to Shannon to respond on the questions about opportunities to better work with the freight rail to advance electrification, which is a challenge.
Yes, it certainly can be. I think one of the challenges is that we have inherently different goals, right? Like, even though we all want to improve the reliability and kind of the throughput of service on these corridors, they have shareholders and are private companies and have a different set of drivers than we do at, potentially looking to move passengers. So I think one of the things we're trying to do now is, alongside this strategy, is to figure out, like I mentioned with the corridor ID process, and service-led planning in general, how to better engage the railroads earlier and more often in this process and through a standardized process. I think in talking with the host railroads in California, they're frankly pretty excited about corridor ID, cautiously excited about corridor ID as well as a framework and a process to have the requests for engagement come to them through a more standardized process. You can imagine from their perspective that they're getting questions all the time from locals, from people that they don't know. Is this part of the Caltrans priority list? Is this part of the rail plan? And everyone says it is, whether or not they've talked to me and to Caltrans. And so Core ID helps us to at least streamline that and come to them with a set of priorities. But I think one thing we're also trying to be better at is, how can we identify what their actual needs are earlier in the process so that we can build that into our projects? I think we have a tendency to just think that they are unwilling to work with us because they don't really care about passenger operations, but that's not really true. It's just, how do we build in more of the shared goals so that we're developing projects that can actually truly meet both the needs of passenger and freight? Because we also, part of the rail plan is improving freight operations. We see a lot of benefits both to goods movement, economic development, but also to just greenhouse gas emissions reductions by being able to move, especially long haul freight, onto rail from trucks and, alleviate capacity at our ports and other intermodal terminals. So, I don't think there's an easy one answer to that. Unfortunately, if anyone has it, we're open to it. But I think improvement in just kind of the upfront coordination and building in predictable timelines for communication, when we expect to review operations analysis with the railroads, when we expect them to engage in environmental clearance, when we need them to review design plans and preliminary engineering concepts, and being as transparent on our end as possible so that it's really predictable, so that hopefully then we can hold them to that same type of accountability on returning deliverables in a timely fashion, so we can actually move projects along to get them implemented, and that everything doesn't end up taking 20 years plus hundreds of millions of dollars more than when we originally scoped a project. But yeah, it's definitely a collaborative process that is just going to take some time, but I am cautiously optimistic that through implementing some of these more predictable processes, it all makes it a little bit easier to kind of engage on a shared framework moving forward.
All right. Thanks. Adriana has another case study or two. We can go to them and then take more of the questions.
Yeah, so another really great component of the state rail plan is service-led planning. So I think one example of why that's really needed is the Ontario Airport Connector project. So in the state rail plan, Ontario Airport, which is in Southern California, the state rail is, pretty close to the Rancho Cucamonga Metrolink, where Brightline West high-speed rail is going to be coming into Southern California. The state rail plan has this area as a high-speed rail hub with multiple electrified rail connections all out of the Ontario Airport. However, currently the local transportation authority is instead pursuing this basically car tunnel project involving autonomous pod vehicles, which, is not a proven technology and it's extremely low capacity. And, this is sort of an opportunity cost in terms of the money it would take to fund this, as well as all of the planning resources going into this versus going into a rail alternative. And they've sort of similarly dismissed a rail alternative with not very good reasoning. California for Electric Rail has been pushing San Bernardino County to properly study a rail connection instead. And this is a case where service-led planning really comes in. Like in this situation, we may need the state to step in and do a lot more of the planning for these rail connections since this local agency is clearly uninterested in doing so. And then if we're talking about service-led planning, we should be funding projects that conform with regional plans. We should not be giving state funding to projects like this one that have really wimpy service goals and are in conflict with larger regional plans. If anybody's interested, there will be a vote on this, but I think, moving forward, I think these are kind of the direction we need to go to deal with projects like this. And then another thing that's very important is the corridor ID program. So talking a little bit about the low sand corridor between, LA and San Diego. This is the highest ridership rail corridor outside of the Northeast. It's been really important, but it was closed for over a year in total a few years ago due to coastal erosion. Basically, the tracks are falling into the ocean in Southern Orange County. And there's a lot of governance challenges that are causing these infrastructure issues. There's still no real definitive plan for an inland route in, San Clemente area, which is really urgently needed. But fortunately, Caltrans is taking over that study, which I think is helpful for its staff because it's clear that Orange County doesn't have the resources or interest to actually properly plan this big investment in a timely manner. But I think we still have kind of ongoing governance issues in this area just because there's so many entities involved. SB 1098 was a bill last year that increased Caltrans oversight over the corridor, and there's a task force associated with this. This is kind of a question for Shannon, maybe curious about what is the status of this and how does Caltrans' role in planning this corridor compare to these local agencies? And to address Brian's question in the chat about how do we stop local agencies from refusing to build the investments in the state rail plan, I think part of the answer is Caltrans actually taking over a lot of those projects and ensuring they get delivered. Actually, I'll get back to Brian's question a little bit. First, I'll pose my question to Shannon about the governance, and then I have another question related to that is, I think this is an area where there's a big hole in the state rail plan is, the state rail plan calls for more than 4 trains per hour between Anaheim and San Diego, which definitely has a business case for electrification, yet electrification is not in the plan. I think this is a big oversight and wondering if there's any insights about why that is.
Okay. I will start with the corridor ID program and kind of the Caltrans, organization of planning work in some of these corridors. So I think the first answer is we are all going to have to continue to work that out. So I don't think there's a single answer. We haven't done corridor ID yet in this way, but I think that it's a real opportunity to act as the framework to also help catch and include some of the work that gets scoped or gets started outside of that process. So I think a lot of the resiliency work, while there is an environmental review component of the service development plans as part of corridor ID, in certain cases, we have more immediate needs. We have larger needs. We have things that are going to take more time to spend dedicated resources focusing on. But we want to make sure that as much of that is brought in under the coordinated corridor ID planning as possible. So I think having Caltrans be the sponsor of that, and then 1098 being led kind of by the California State Transportation Agency oversight, who, is our umbrella agency, it will just help us continue to make sure that we're using the same time horizons, we're using the same methodologies, the same, again, tools and planning processes so that all of the outputs from, in either direction become inputs into the other studies, and we're iterating from that work and really just bringing as much into the scope of corridor ID as possible. And then really only doing what we need to do on these projects truly when they're outside of the scope of corridor ID. I also think SB 1098 is really great because it's obviously being led by Senator Blakespear. And I think that political attention to this is also really needed. And I think that is something that we can't necessarily get through Corridor ID. It really is a planning and kind of technical process. And this brings in some of the politics and the policy that we're also going to need to help dedicate more resources, financial resources, but also potential streamlining resources on regulation and approvals and things as we get into really sensitive environmental areas that we need to make decisions, whether it's continuing to improve the rail lines or relocate the rail lines inland or any of the decisions that will get made. So I'd say still a little bit TBD, but yeah, the idea is that it'll all be brought in with the same partners iterating on this so that we're not doing these isolated planning efforts that aren't coordinated. And I will get to the other question, but I see that there's a lot of questions about federal funding related to Corridor ID. And so I wanted to just jump in to answer those as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you for taking on the elephant in the room.
Yeah. What's happening at the federal government? I think we all know that we don't know. But I think a couple of things. So what we do know right now is that the Federal Railroad Administration is still telling us to move along. And so they're all still mostly in their positions, which is great news, and moving ahead with Corridor ID. And so until we hear otherwise, that is our plan and that is our process. That said, I think we are obviously anticipating that could change. But from the perspective of CalSTA and Caltrans, we are really committed to kind of standing up this planning process in the way that Corridor ID has established it. And so what that means is that, we're looking at ways that we could fill a resource gap should one exist to be able to stand up this program. That may mean that we have to change the scope of some of our corridors. It may mean we might have to change some of the timelines that we're looking at, but we don't want to let this program go because of all of the things I explained. This is a good organizing tool. We think this is the correct way to do planning to move us along in coordination with the host railroads and get into quicker environmental review times, which ultimately get us to final design and construction sooner. And if and when a new administration brings this program back, we also don't want to be, caught on our back heels that now we have to start over and we're 4 years behind where we could have been already funding projects and getting things ready for implementation. So, of course, none of us know exactly what that looks like, but we are trying to come up with some backup plans and set things up. Again, having a good process, and to Eric's point, building out our team and having the internal resources at the state that we are able to keep things going, whether it's a scaled back version or to the same magnitude that we have now to continue to advance the priority projects through a coordinated planning and project development phase. Certainly, I think the bigger question is what happens if, let's say, Corridor ID remains, but then we get to the end and Fed-state partnership doesn't exist. That could certainly happen. Or we get to the end and California is no longer competitive for Fed-state partnership. That could certainly happen. But I still think that this is the right way to do planning and will help us design more efficient and targeted and strategic projects that will also help these projects compete better at a state level. For better or for worse, rail was not really funded we didn't get a lot of funding through the federal government until the infrastructure bill was passed a few years ago. We were obviously looking forward to a big influx of support that we could leverage with our state dollars, but ultimately we do still have decently strong support through our federal funding programs, both through the SB1 programs like Solutions for Congested Corridors, as well as some of the cap and trade programs like the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program and the State Rail Assistance Program. So there is still money at the state level. Is it enough? No. Is it as much as if we had the federal support? No. But there are ways to still be strategic in leveraging that to use the outputs of a coordinated planning process to prioritize how we award those funds. And projects that are aligned with and in Corridor ID where eligible are going to compete better for state projects as well. They're going to inherently get that support from the state. And I think that will still help us make good decisions on implementation. I saw a couple questions on why SMART wasn't listed, why Santa Cruz wasn't listed. A thing I forgot to mention with Corridor ID or underscore is that this is explicitly for intercity passenger rail. In California, we think of and we design the network agnostically to the operator and to their federal regulatory agency. Unfortunately, the federal government does not do that. And so there are technically commuter rail designation for some of the corridors like SMART, like Caltrain, like Metrolink, and others that are not eligible to be in the Corridor ID program because they are not intercity passenger rail services. Where there is overlap, where we share corridors like we do in many cases, like in Metrolink and the Surfliner example, great. Then that's a benefit. We can deliver benefits to more than one service. SMART, unfortunately, though, in the eyes of the federal government, is a commuter rail operator. And so while there is an extension to Novato in our capital corridor that we will be planning for, the mainline services there are currently excluded from intercity passenger rail planning. So that's kind of the answer on that front. And Santa Cruz is included. So I think I answered a lot of those questions that I caught.
Thanks. You had mentioned quicker environmental review, which is obviously part of the time and cost of these projects. Is there anything that you would like to share also, Eric and Adriana, about ways of using environmental review in a way that is more cost effective and time effective?
Yeah, I'll quickly just answer the corridor ID and then I want to let them talk. But the service development planning step of corridor ID step 2 is inherently very robust because it is meant to really finish all of the planning and not push any of the planning decisions into the environmental review process. And so the timeline and the scope for doing the service development plans may seem larger than people are used to or comfortable with, but that is intentional so that we are doing a lot of the good iterative planning that we need to do in engaging the host railroads and doing that operations analysis in that process. So by the time we move on to preliminary engineering and environmental review, we have as much buy-in as we're going to get from the host railroads, as defined of a project as we can before getting into an environmental review process, and are really ready to just focus on environmental review.
Eric and Adriana, anything to add to that?
I would just quickly say, exactly what Shannon said. The thing I like so much about CID is that it now puts the cart behind the horse, right? So you are doing your scoping intentionally. You're saying, this is really the project we want to do, more or less. And you're not taking 30 alternatives into NEPA and then having to do all this engineering work and spending a lot of time going through that process. You can really sort of hit the sort of statutory time limits on everything. And I think it's like 18 months. You can get through it if you really are pushing rather than like looking at everything. And I think that's what's so beautiful about CID. It is really incentivizing and paying for us to do that planning homework upfront rather than trying to get a full funding grant agreement. I'm speaking from the transit side, and then sort of doing all your planning, which doesn't ever work out well.
Yeah, thanks. One additional thing I'd add is that our Californians for Electric Rail passed a bill last year, AB 2503, that actually exempts a lot of the state rail plan from environmental review, at least for CEQA. And there's a bill, SB 71, that will make that exemption permanent. So that will also, help speed some of this up. And an additional thing is building state capacity to do self-certification under NEPA. So the California High-Speed Rail Authority currently has that authority, and the vision would be that rather than hiring, expensive consultants to do these environmental review documents, local agencies can get the state to do it a lot more cheaply and quickly in sort of a standardized way that's going to also speed up timelines and, particularly protect from lawsuits.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks. There was another question about electrification and the role of batteries and hydrogen. We're going to need the on 1 foot version of that answer. And then I want to close with some legislation and funding actions that people can really engage with to help bring some of this good vision and planning about.
Yeah, so I would say all propulsion options are currently under evaluation. So that includes hydrogen, battery electric, overhead electric configurations. We're looking to determine which is best suited for each of these corridors and each of these services. And I would also say that right now, we think hydrogen fuel cell in many of these cases is the most practical option to begin our zero emission transition. It has a much longer range than battery electric trains, and it provides kind of a balance of the environmental and economic viability benefits. But we're looking at everything. Things can be convertible. We want to do the things that, again, much like the planning, where can we derive interim benefits now and really start providing as much service as we can, and looking to the places where we can electrify sooner. Maybe we just do that. In the places where we think hydrogen or other options can fill more of a long-term need, we're open to that as well. But I think, the discussion, it's new and it's changing all the time. And we do appreciate, the experts and the advocates continuing to push us for the best solutions. And, we want to continue to work on all that.
Okay. And anything from Adriana or Eric before switching to some of the legislation and funding opportunities that are before us in the immediate and longer term?
I would say we have taken a lot of issues with Caltrans' strategy on hydrogen in the past, and the state rail plan is an improvement, but could be better on that regard still. I don't have time to get into it, but you can check out our website, calelectricrail.org, for resources on some of the issues with hydrogen trains. But let's move on to how do we make this happen, which is really important. Before we get it, there's some very specific deliverables, but just to answer Brian's question a little bit about what if agencies don't want to cooperate with the state rail plan. So we've got a few things. I think part of that is, Caltrans is already taking on more of the role on project planning, which is good. I would like to see in the long term them also take on design and engineering capacity so that, local governments who don't have the capacity or interest to do it can just get Caltrans to do it much more cost effectively than hiring consultants. Then if projects are at 60% design, which is important and conform with the state rail plan, there should be formula funds that are awarded automatically. Again, this is going to require reforms to make that happen, but that's the goal. And then the state rail plan projects get built on time and under budget if you have 1 and 2. That's the idea. So how do we actually implement that? So I already mentioned on the project delivery reform, I already mentioned the SB 71 expanding the CEQA exemption. And I've seen a few comments in the chat about this, but another important issue that also addresses Brian's question is third-party permitting reform, which puts, enforceable timelines on third parties like local governments or utilities to provide construction permits. That's really important for moving project forward. That is up for vote this year. We'd also like to see future legislation to make sure that funding actually conforms with the state rail plan and that we're not awarding projects to things that aren't using service-led planning. There's been a lot of questions about what do we do with the federal government, and I think that is kind of the elephant in the room. The state rail plan does have over $300 billion in investments that we need. And, ideally, this would be funded through formula funding. The All Aboard Act is an example, but, not discretionary, not a complicated grant program. The All Aboard Act is like a federal level version of this that's probably not going to pass anytime soon, but we could implement something similar at the state level. And then the cap and trade reauthorization, which is happening this year, is really what we need to do to fund these rail projects in the short term and making sure that, there's all the money we need to make these investments. And that's something we can all engage with later this year. I also say we need to fund a staff capacity for planning as well as ideally design and engineering to make sure all this stuff gets built.
All right. Thanks very much, Adriana. And legislation like the SB 2503 that streamlined electrification and the permitting and environmental streamlining and the funding don't happen like all by themselves. And having constituents that are, ready and willing to speak to their legislators is really important. We will send out information with the slides and with the information about the legislation and funding afterward as well. Wanted to very much thank the panelists for a very informative hour and look forward to the opportunities that, we in the audience who are civically active residents can do to help move things forward. And those of us who are professionals in the audience can put this into practice in, people's jobs to also help make this good vision happen. So thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.